The crowd burst into laughter the moment the wooden coffin touched the ground. Under the harsh afternoon sun of an Accra street market, a thin man struggled to steady himself beside the cheap box he had just bought. Dust clung to the rough wood. Vendors paused their shouting. Phones lifted into the air. "Look at him," someone mocked. "A rich man buying his own coffin." The man's hands trembled as pain twisted through his chest. Then suddenly, he collapsed beside the coffin. People stepped back, whispering, some still laughing. Only one person moved forward. An old woman in a faded headscarf, Nana Amasarwa, knelt beside him and lifted his head gently onto her lap. The man opened his eyes and tears filled them, because the man lying beside that coffin was not a beggar. He was Felix Quansah, one of the richest men in Ghana.
Before we continue this story, tell me in the comments what country are you watching from and what time is it there right now. Stories like this remind us how powerful compassion can be, even in the darkest moments. If you enjoy emotional African stories about justice, healing, and unexpected kindness, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one.
Felix Quansah had spent most of his life believing that power could solve anything. In Accra, his name carried the weight of an empire. Quansah Holdings controlled ports, construction contracts, transport routes, and warehouses across Ghana and beyond. Politicians requested meetings with him weeks in advance. International investors competed for his attention. Newspapers called him the man who could move a city with one signature. But Felix rarely smiled. At 55 years old, he lived in a sprawling mansion overlooking the Atlantic coast. The house had glass walls, marble floors imported from Italy, and a staff large enough to run a small hotel. Yet the dining table, designed for 12, was almost always occupied by just one person. Felix Quansah. Every evening his housekeeper would place a single plate at the center of the long table. The rest of the chairs remained empty. Felix never seemed to notice. He spent his days in boardrooms, construction sites, and private offices where decisions worth millions were made in quiet conversations. Employees described him as precise, calm, and terrifyingly efficient. If a project failed, he replaced the manager. If a partner hesitated, he found another. If someone complained, he paid them off. Problems disappeared quickly around Felix Quansah, until the day his own body became a problem he could not negotiate with. It began with a dull ache in his chest. At first, Felix ignored it. Long hours and constant travel had always come with small discomforts. A glass of water, a short rest, and he would move on. But the pain returned, and returned again. Soon it was accompanied by exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fix. One morning, while signing documents in his office tower overlooking Independence Avenue, Felix suddenly stopped writing. The pen slipped from his fingers. His assistant, a young woman named Lydia, noticed the unusual silence. Sir Felix pressed his palm against his chest. "Cancel the afternoon meetings," he said quietly. Within an hour, he was sitting inside the quiet consultation room of Accra Central Hospital. Across from him sat Dr. Kofi Mensah, one of Ghana's leading oncology specialists. The doctor had a calm face, the kind that had delivered both hope and heartbreak to hundreds of families. A thick medical file lay open on the desk. For a long moment, Dr. Mensah said nothing. Felix noticed the hesitation. "Doctor," he said evenly, "I prefer direct answers." Dr. Mensah nodded slowly. "I will be direct, Mr. Quansah." He folded his hands. "The tests confirm a malignant tumor." Felix's expression did not change. "Stage 4, the doctor continued quietly. "It has already spread." The room seemed to shrink. Outside the window, the sounds of Accra traffic continued as if nothing had changed. Felix leaned back slightly. How long? Dr. Mensah did not answer immediately. With aggressive treatment, perhaps a year. And without. The doctor looked into his eyes. A few months. Silence filled the room. Most people, when they heard news like this, reacted instantly, shock, anger, denial. Felix Quansah did none of those things. Instead, he stared at the wall behind the doctor. Chemotherapy, Dr. Mensah said gently. Targeted treatment. It could slow the progression. Felix finally spoke. Will it cure it? No. Will it restore my health? Dr. Mensah hesitated. It may give you more time. Felix nodded slowly. I see. The doctor leaned forward. Mr. Quansah, I understand this is difficult, but modern treatment can improve quality of life. Many patients. Felix raised a hand. Doctor! His voice remained calm. If I begin treatment, I will spend my remaining months in hospitals and clinics. That is possible, yes. And if I do not, you may remain physically independent for some time. Those symptoms will gradually worsen. Felix stood up. Dr. Mensah looked surprised. You should take time to consider your options, the doctor said. Felix adjusted his suit jacket. I have considered them. You're declining treatment for now. The doctor studied him carefully. I must ask you something, Dr. Mensah said softly. Felix paused at the door. Are you afraid of dying? Felix did not answer immediately. He turned slightly. I am not afraid of death. Then he added quietly, I am afraid of something else. Dr. Mensah watched him. Unfinished truth, the doctor said gently. Many patients feel that. Felix's eyes narrowed slightly. For the first time since entering the hospital, his composure cracked just slightly. He left without another word. Outside the hospital, the sunlight felt unusually bright. His driver hurried toward him. Sir, should we return to the office? Felix looked at the car. Then he shook his head. No, home. Felix paused. For the first time in years, the word home sounded strange. Yes, he said eventually. The car moved through Accra's busy streets. Vendors called out beside traffic lights. School children walked along dusty sidewalks. Construction cranes stood against the sky like giant metal skeletons. Felix watched it all silently. By the time the car reached his mansion near Labadi Beach, the sun was beginning to lower toward the ocean. The gates opened automatically. Inside the compound, gardeners trimmed hedges while security guards stood at attention. Everything looked exactly as it had the day before. Perfect, controlled, predictable. Felix walked into the vast living room where the sound of the ocean drifted faintly through the glass walls. For the first time in decades, he felt something unfamiliar. Helplessness. He poured himself a glass of water and sat in a chair facing the sea. Minutes passed, then an hour. No phone calls, no meetings, no decisions worth millions. Just silence. His mind began drifting through memories he had buried for years. Deals made, people replaced, land purchased, buildings constructed, lives altered by the rise of Quansah Holdings. Felix had always told himself those decisions were necessary. Business required strength. Emotion was weakness. But as the sun sank into the Atlantic, another thought entered his mind. When I die, what will remain? Not buildings, not contracts, not money. Those things would belong to someone else within weeks. He suddenly realized something unsettling. In all the years of building his empire, he had never truly asked himself whether it was worth the cost. Felix stood slowly. He walked toward his private office inside the mansion. A portrait of himself receiving an international business award hung on the wall. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned away. Inside the office, his safe opened with a quiet, electronic click. Stacks of documents lay inside: property titles, share certificates, contracts. The foundation of his empire. Felix removed the first file. He placed it on the desk, then another and another. When his lawyer received a call later that night, the instructions sounded simple, but impossible. "I want everything prepared for liquidation," Felix said calmly. "Everything?" the lawyer asked in disbelief. "Yes. The companies, the properties, yes." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Mr. Quansah, may I ask why?" Felix looked out the window toward the dark ocean. His answer was quiet. "I do not need an empire anymore." Another pause. "What do you need?" Felix closed the folder in front of him. "A coffin." The first rumor began, 3 days later. At the headquarters of Quansah Holdings, a glass tower rising above Central Accra, senior executives gathered around the long boardroom table with tight expressions. Normally, Felix Quansah chaired these meetings with cold efficiency. His absence felt unnatural, like a machine missing its engine. Lydia, Felix's assistant, stood near the projector screen, clutching a folder. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "Mr. Quansah will not attend today." Murmurs spread around the table. Again, one director asked. Another leaned forward. "This is the third meeting he's canceled this week." Across the table sat Richard Quansah, Felix's cousin. Richard was a tall man in his early 50s with sharp cheekbones and an easy smile that rarely reached his eyes. He tapped a pen thoughtfully against the table. "Perhaps Felix simply needs rest," Richard said calmly. The tone sounded supportive, but something behind it felt calculating. "What concerns me," another board member said, "is the message we received from the legal department." Lydia hesitated. The projector screen lit up with documents, asset liquidation orders, properties scheduled for sale, company shares transferred to brokerage accounts. The room erupted. This must be a mistake. Felix would never sell controlling shares. This could destabilize the entire group. But the documents were real. Felix Quansah had begun selling pieces of his empire. The board members looked at each other in disbelief. Only Richard remained quiet. Inside, however, his mind was racing. So, it begins. For years, Richard had waited for an opportunity like this. Felix had always been the stronger man, more disciplined, more respected, more feared. But now the foundation was shifting. Richard leaned back in his chair. "Let's not panic," he said smoothly. "Felix is still the chairman. Until he explains his intentions, speculation will only harm the company." The words sounded reasonable. Yet when the meeting ended, Richard made a call the moment he stepped into the corridor. "Find out where Felix is spending his time," he said quietly, "and keep this discreet." Meanwhile, Felix Quansah was nowhere near the corporate tower. Instead, he sat in a quiet office with his personal lawyer, Kwame Ofori. Kwame had known Felix for nearly 20 years. He had helped structure mergers, protect assets, and navigate legal battles worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But today, as he studied the documents Felix had handed him, his usually calm face looked deeply unsettled. "Felix," Kwame said slowly, "these instructions, they are not normal." Felix sat across from him, perfectly composed. "I did not hire you for normal situations. You are dissolving long-term holdings," Kwame continued. "Factories, shipping contracts, properties abroad. This is not simple restructuring." Felix said nothing. Kwame lowered the papers. "If the board sees this, they will demand answers. They will get none." Kwame leaned forward. "Felix, listen to me carefully. You built Quansah Holdings over 30 years. Thousands of employees depend on these companies. You cannot dismantle everything overnight." Felix's expression remained calm. "Then we will dismantle it slowly." Kwame stared at him. Why? Felix looked toward the window. Outside, the streets of Accra buzzed with afternoon life. Vendors moved between cars, balancing trays of fruit and bottled water. Construction cranes stood in the distance where another Quansah project was rising. For decades, Felix had watched the city grow, through the glass windows of boardrooms. Now it looked different, almost fragile. "I am finished building things," Felix said, quietly. Kwame frowned. "You're 55 years old." Felix turned his gaze back to him. "And dying." The word hung in the air. Kwame's face drained of color. What Felix spoke with the same calm tone he used during negotiations. "Stage 4 cancer. A few months left." The lawyer sat frozen. "You're sure?" "Yes." "Treatment?" "I declined." Kwame ran a hand across his face, trying to process the information. My God. For the first time in years, he looked not at the billionaire client sitting across from him, but at a man. A tired man. "You should fight this," Kwame said quietly. "Medicine advances every year. People survive longer than expected." Felix shook his head slightly. "That is not the point." Then what is Felix reached for one of the folders. Inside was a list of assets scheduled for sale. Homes, ships, land, companies. My entire life. Felix said slowly, "I believed that wealth gave me control." He closed the folder. "But death is the only contract that cannot be negotiated." Kwame watched him silently. "So what do you intend to do with the money?" the lawyer asked. Felix leaned back. "Nothing." Kwame blinked. "What I will sell, everything." And then Felix's voice was quiet. "I will prepare for burial." The lawyer thought he had misheard. "Burial." "Yes." Kwame stared at him. "You mean arrangements, funeral planning." No matter, Felix's eyes were steady. "A coffin." The word sounded absurd in the elegant office. "You're joking," Kwame said. Felix did not smile. "I want a simple wooden coffin." Kwame shook his head slowly. "Felix, people with your resources hold state funerals. Presidents attend. Entire cities close their streets." Felix looked almost amused. "Exactly. And you want none of that?" "No." The lawyer leaned forward. Why Felix paused. For a moment it seemed like he might say something deeper. Instead, he answered simply, "Because I do not deserve it." Kwame was stunned. "You built hospitals," he said, "scholarship programs, infrastructure projects." Felix's eyes hardened slightly. "Business investments," he corrected. "Still, do not rewrite my history to comfort yourself." The room fell silent. Kwame studied him carefully. He had known Felix for 2 decades, but something about the man had changed. Not weaker, not frightened, just tired. "What exactly do you plan to do next?" the lawyer asked. Felix stood up. "Walk." Kwame frowned. "Walk where?" Felix adjusted his jacket. "Outside." The answer sounded simple, but it carried an unusual finality. That evening, for the first time in years, Felix Quansah left his mansion without a convoy of security vehicles. He dismissed the driver. "I will return later," he said. "But sir, that is all." Felix stepped onto the sidewalk outside the gates. The ocean wind carried the smell of salt and traffic. Cars passed. Motorcycles weaved through traffic. A group of children chased a football across a dusty patch of ground nearby. No one noticed the billionaire walking slowly along the road. And, for the first time in decades, Felix Quansah moved through the city, not as a powerful man, but as an ordinary one. He passed a roadside stall selling roasted corn, a woman balancing oranges on her head, a mechanic repairing a broken taxi. The life of Accra unfolded around him in ways he had never truly seen before. Not from behind tinted windows, not through corporate reports, but directly, up close, real. As the sun dipped lower, Felix stopped outside a small furniture shop near the market district. Wooden chairs and cabinets stood outside under a faded sign. At the corner of the display sat something else, a row of simple wooden coffins, roughly built, unpainted, affordable. Felix stared at them for a long moment. The shop owner noticed him. "You looking for furniture?" the man asked casually. Felix pointed. "How much for that one?" The shop owner followed his finger. The cheapest coffin. He shrugged. 200 cedis. Felix nodded slowly. I'll take it. The coffin maker stared at Felix Quansah for several seconds, trying to decide whether the man in front of him was serious. It was late afternoon in the busy Makola market district. The streets pulsed with the familiar rhythm of Accra vendors shouting prices, taxi horns blaring radios, playing high-life music from nearby stalls. And in the middle of all that noise stood a man, in a neatly pressed but simple shirt pointing calmly at the cheapest coffin in the shop. You want that one? The coffin maker asked again. Felix nodded. Yes. The man scratched his head. Most of his customers came grieving. They arrived with relatives speaking softly and bargaining with sadness in their eyes. But this customer looked different. There was no family, no urgency, no mourning, just a quiet certainty. Is someone dead? The coffin maker asked cautiously. Felix's gaze remained steady. Not yet. The man shifted uncomfortably. Well, we usually deliver when the time comes. I'll take it now. The coffin maker laughed awkwardly, thinking it must be a strange joke. But Felix reached into his pocket and placed a thick roll of cash on the wooden counter. 200 cedis. Exactly the price. The laughter stopped. You really want it? Yes. The coffin maker shrugged. In that case, it's yours. He and another worker dragged the rough wooden coffin forward, setting it on the ground beside the stall. As they did, a few nearby vendors turned to look. A man buying spare car parts leaned closer. What's happening? That man just bought a coffin, someone replied. For who? He says it's for himself. Within seconds, curiosity spread through the small crowd. People began gathering. Some whispered, others laughed openly. A young man lifted his phone and began recording. Hey, look at this, he shouted to his friends. A living man buying his own coffin. The crowd laughed. Felix stood quietly beside the wooden box. He did not react. He simply looked at the coffin. It was smaller than he expected. Rough planks, no polish, no decoration, just wooden nails. For a moment he imagined lying inside it. The thought did not frighten him. It felt logical. A woman in the crowd shook her head. This man must be cursed. Another said, maybe he lost all his money. Someone else laughed loudly. Or maybe he wants to practice dying. The laughter grew louder. Felix closed his eyes briefly as a wave of pain moved through his chest. It was stronger today, sharper. He pressed a hand against his ribs. The coffin maker noticed. You okay? He asked. Felix nodded faintly. Yes. But the pain did not fade. Instead, it spread, tightening across his chest, like a heavy rope being pulled. The crowd kept laughing. Phones kept recording. One man stepped closer. Hey, old man, he said mockingly. Why buy a coffin when you're still breathing? Felix opened his eyes. His voice was quiet. Because I won't be for long. The man blinked. Then he burst into laughter. Listen to him. But Felix was no longer listening. The world around him began to blur. The sounds of the market stretched into distant echoes. He tried to take a breath. The air refused to come. Suddenly his legs gave way. Felix Quansah collapsed beside the coffin. Gasps rippled through the crowd. For a moment, no one moved. Then someone muttered nervously. Is he acting? Maybe it's a stunt. Don't touch him. The man who had been recording stepped back quickly. I'm not getting involved, another voice said. Call someone, but no one did. The crowd formed a loose circle, watching the man lying beside the coffin he had just purchased. His breathing was shallow, his face pale, and still, many people simply stared. Then a new voice cut through the noise. Move. It was quiet, but firm. An elderly woman pushed gently through the crowd. She wore a faded blue wrapper and a simple headscarf. In one hand, She carried a small basket filled with sachets of water and ginger roots. This was Nana Amaserwa. People recognized her from the nearby church where she often sat selling herbs and water to passers-by. "Hey, Mama, leave it," someone said. "You don't know what is wrong with him." She ignored them. Instead, she knelt beside Felix. His eyes were half closed, struggling to stay conscious. Nana Amaserwa lifted his head gently and rested it on her lap. Her hands were rough from years of work, but the touch was gentle. Felix's breathing steadied slightly. The crowd grew quiet. "What are you doing?" the coffin maker asked nervously. "Helping," she replied simply. She opened one of her sachets of water and dabbed a little onto Felix's lips. "Drink small," she murmured. Felix's eyes slowly opened. The first thing he saw was the lined face of the old woman leaning over him. For a moment he thought he was dreaming. Then she spoke again. "You should not lie on the ground like this," she said softly. Felix tried to sit up, but another wave of pain stopped him. The old woman studied him carefully. Her gaze was not curious. It was knowing. "You are sick," she said. Felix exhaled weakly. "Yes." The crowd whispered among themselves. Someone finally asked, "Mama, do you know him?" She shook her head. "No." Felix looked at her surprised. She continued calmly. "But sickness like this does not come only from the body." Felix stared at her. "What do you mean?" She leaned closer. Her voice dropped so only he could hear. "A man who buys his own coffin while still breathing." She paused. "Is not afraid of death." Felix felt something tighten in his chest. Not pain this time, but something deeper. The old woman's eyes held his. "You are afraid of something else." Felix tried to look away, but he couldn't. The crowd waited. Then, the old woman spoke the words that would echo in Felix's mind for the rest of his life. "You are afraid of remembering." For the first time since leaving the hospital, Felix Quansah felt tears fill his eyes. The crowd gasped. Someone whispered, "Why is he crying?" But Felix did not answer. Because in that moment, lying beside the cheap coffin in the middle of Accra's busiest market, a truth he had buried for decades, had just been spoken aloud by a poor old woman who claimed she did not even know his name. And somehow, she was right. For several minutes after Felix collapsed, the crowd in Makola Market did not disperse. People whispered among themselves, their curiosity stronger than their sympathy. Phones were still raised recording the strange scene, a well-dressed man lying beside a cheap coffin, his head resting on the lap of an elderly woman who looked like she barely owned more than the basket beside her. Nana Amaserwa ignored them all. Her attention remained on Felix. She placed one hand gently on his shoulder and spoke in a calm voice. "Breathe slowly." Felix followed the rhythm of her words. Inhale, exhale. The sharp pain in his chest slowly began to loosen. Around them, the late afternoon market continued moving. Traders shouted prices. Metal carts rattled over uneven pavement. A group of children squeezed through the crowd, trying to see what was happening. "Is he dead?" one boy asked. "Not yet," another replied. The coffin maker scratched his head nervously. "Maybe someone should take him to a clinic," he muttered. Felix opened his eyes again. The old woman was still there. Her face was deeply lined. The marks of many decades lived under sun and hardship. Yet there was something steady about her presence, something that made the chaos of the market feel strangely distant. "You should sit up," she said gently. With her help, Felix slowly pushed himself upright. The world swayed slightly, but he managed to stay seated beside the coffin. The crowd reacted immediately. "Hey, he's alive, I told you he was acting." Someone laughed again. Felix heard them, but their voices felt far away. Instead, he found himself looking at the old woman. You helped me, he said quietly. She shrugged. You needed help. That doesn't mean people usually give it. She gave a small smile. Then those people are foolish. Felix almost laughed at that. He studied her basket. Inside were sachets of water, a few small ginger roots and several wrapped herbs. You sell these? He asked. Yes, here in the market, sometimes here, sometimes near the church. Felix nodded slowly. You must work very hard. Nana Amasawa tilted her head slightly. Everyone works hard, she said simply. Her eyes drifted toward the coffin beside him. That one is yours. Yes. You bought it today. Yes. She looked at the rough wood for a moment, then back at Felix. You plan to use it soon? Felix did not answer immediately. Yes, he said eventually. The old woman did not react with shock or laughter like the others had. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully. You are preparing yourself. Felix frowned slightly. That surprises you, no? What surprises you then? That you are doing it alone. The words landed heavier than Felix expected. For a moment, he did not know how to respond. The crowd around them had begun to thin. The spectacle was losing its excitement, now that the man beside the coffin was no longer collapsing dramatically. People returned to their stalls. Traffic noise returned to normal. Felix stood slowly. His legs felt weak but stable. Nana Amasawa remained seated beside the coffin. You should rest, she said. I've rested enough in my life. She raised an eyebrow. You look like a man who has never rested at all. Felix considered that. Perhaps she was right. Where do you live? She asked. Felix gestured vaguely toward the distant coastline. Near Labadi. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. That is not a poor area. No. You walked all the way here. Yes. Why, Felix looked around the market. The noise, the movement, the people bargaining over tomatoes and cloth and spare parts. I wanted to see something real, he said. The old woman nodded slowly as if she understood exactly what he meant. Rich people often forget how the world looks from the ground. Felix gave a faint smile. I suppose I did. She stood carefully brushing dust from her wrapper. So she said, What will you do now? Felix looked down at the coffin. I will take it with me. The coffin maker overheard and quickly stepped forward. You will carry it yourself, Felix shrugged. It's mine, the man laughed. It's heavier than you think. Felix bent slightly and gripped the edge. The coffin lifted a few centimeters before he felt the strain in his chest again. Not pain this time, just weakness. Nana Amasawa watched quietly. You should not carry that alone, she said. I've carried worse things. Maybe she replied calmly, but those things are what made you buy it. Felix froze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she continued, Leave it here for today. Felix shook his head. No. Why? He hesitated. Because if I leave it here, I might not come back. But he did not say that aloud. Instead, he asked, Why do you care? The question sounded harsher than he intended. Yet, Nana Amasawa did not seem offended. Because you are a human being, she answered simply. Felix looked at her carefully. You don't even know my name. That is not important. Most people would want to know. Names can wait. She pointed gently toward the coffin. But that thing cannot. Felix exhaled slowly. You speak like someone who has buried many people. I have. Family. Yes, friends, yes. She paused. And strangers. Felix studied her. You must have lived a difficult life. The old woman gave a soft laugh. Difficult lives are common. Peaceful hearts are rare. Felix felt those words settle somewhere deep inside him. He looked again at the coffin. The rough boards, the simple shape, the certainty it represented. I thought buying it would make things easier, he admitted quietly. Did it? Felix shook his head. No. Nana Ama Serwa nodded. That is because you are trying to bury the wrong thing. Felix frowned. What do you mean? She met his eyes. You are not trying to bury your body. Her voice softened. You are trying to bury your memories. The words struck him like a sudden gust of wind. For several seconds, Felix said nothing, because deep inside, he knew she was right. Finally, he asked the question that had been forming in his mind since she first knelt beside him. Why are you helping me? Nana Ama Serwa picked up her basket. She looked toward the small church visible at the end of the street. Because sometimes, she said quietly, God sends the tired ones to the poor, so someone will finally tell them the truth. Felix watched her carefully. And what truth is that? She turned back toward him. Her expression was calm, that the past cannot be buried in wood. Her eyes moved briefly toward the coffin. It always finds a way to rise again. Felix felt a chill move through him, because for the first time in many years the memory of a name he had tried desperately to forget returned clearly to his mind. Ifua Nyarko, and with it, the day everything had gone wrong. The sun was beginning to sink behind the buildings of Accra when Felix Quansah finally lifted the coffin again. The crowd at Makola Market had mostly dispersed. Vendors were packing their goods into sacks, folding tables, or covering stalls with tarps before evening rain threatened. Only a few curious onlookers still lingered nearby, whispering about the strange man who had bought his own coffin. Felix gripped the wooden edge and tried again. This time he managed to raise one end of it from the ground. The rough wood scraped against the pavement as he slowly dragged it closer to the roadside. The coffin maker watched with mild concern. You should let someone help you, the man said. Felix shook his head. No. The coffin maker shrugged. Suit yourself. A taxi driver passing nearby slowed his car and leaned out of the window. You moving house or burying someone, he joked. Felix ignored him. His breathing had grown heavier, but the pain from earlier had faded into a dull pressure. The doctor's words echoed quietly in his mind. Stage 4. A few months, perhaps less. Felix paused beside the coffin and looked down at it again. For a moment the noise of the market faded, and another memory began to form in his mind, one he had spent years pushing away. Ifua Nyarko. The name carried with it a strange mix of warmth and regret. There had been a time, decades earlier, when Felix Quansah was not yet the powerful man Accra knew today. He had been young, ambitious, hungry. At 25, Felix had only one dream, to become the richest man his village had ever seen. He believed success required sacrifice, long nights, hard choices, and sometimes broken promises. Ifua Nyarko had entered his life during those years. She had been a nursing student at a hospital clinic on the outskirts of Accra. They met when Felix visited the clinic after injuring his hand at a construction site where he was supervising his first small building project. She had treated his wound, but more importantly, she had treated him like a human being. Not a businessman, not a future tycoon, just Felix. He remembered the way she laughed easily, the way she spoke about helping people, instead of making money. At the time, Felix had found her optimism almost naive, yet he had fallen in love with her anyway. For 2 years they built a life together in a small rented apartment near Kainchi Market. Felix worked day and night trying to grow his company. Ifua studied, volunteered at clinics, and waited for him to return home late each evening. Those were the last years Felix could remember feeling genuinely happy, but ambition has a way of changing people. When Felix received his first major contract, an infrastructure deal worth millions, the stakes suddenly became much higher. Investors demanded his full attention. Banks demanded guarantees. Opportunities appeared faster than he could process them, And somewhere along the way, love began to feel like a distraction. Felix leaned against the coffin in the fading light. The memory continued unfolding. Efua had come home one evening holding a small envelope. Her hands were trembling slightly. "I have news," she told him. Felix had barely looked up from the documents covering their kitchen table. "What is it?" She smiled nervously. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, Felix had said nothing. The words echoed through the small apartment. Pregnant. He should have felt joy. Instead, he felt panic. At that time, Felix's entire future depended on investors believing he was focused, disciplined, unstoppable. A child meant responsibility, distraction, complication. Efua noticed the silence immediately. "You're not happy," she said softly. Felix forced a smile. "No, I'm just surprised." But the truth was already forming inside him. This is bad timing. Weeks later, the situation became even more complicated. The contract Felix had been chasing was finally within reach, but only if he could convince a group of wealthy partners that his company was stable and free from personal distractions. One investor had said something that stuck in Felix's mind. "Business is war, Mr. Quansah. The moment people see weakness, they attack." Felix interpreted those words in the worst possible way, and so, slowly, quietly, he began distancing himself from Efua. Longer work hours, missed dinners, cold conversations, until one evening the argument finally exploded. "You're avoiding me," Efua said, standing in the doorway of their apartment. Felix didn't look up. "I'm working. You've been working every night. That's what success requires." "And what about us?" Felix exhaled sharply. "This is exactly what I mean," he said. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under." Efua's voice trembled. "I understand that I'm carrying your child." The room fell silent. Felix closed his eyes briefly. Then he said the words he would regret for the rest of his life. "Maybe this isn't the right time for a child." Efua stared at him. "You want me to get rid of it?" Felix did not answer. The silence said enough. Efua stepped back slowly. "I thought you loved me." Felix's voice was flat. "I do, but not enough." The next morning she was gone. No note, no explanation. Just an empty apartment. At the time, Felix convinced himself it was for the best. He buried the memory under years of business success. He told himself she had moved on, found someone else, started a new life. But now, standing beside a cheap coffin in the fading light of Makola Market, Felix realized something he had never allowed himself to consider before. What if she hadn't? A voice interrupted his thoughts. "You are thinking about someone." Felix turned. Nana Amasarwa was standing a few steps away, her basket still resting on her arm. "I thought you left," Felix said quietly. "I did." "Then why come back?" She looked toward the coffin. "You looked like a man who might collapse again." Felix almost smiled. Probably true. She studied his face carefully. That woman's name was Efua, wasn't it? Felix froze. For a moment, the entire market seemed to disappear. "How do you know that name?" he asked slowly. The old woman did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked closer and rested a hand lightly on the edge of the coffin. Her eyes met his. "Because," she said quietly, "some stories do not end when people walk away." Felix felt his pulse quicken. "What are you saying?" Nana Amasarwa looked at him with an expression that was both gentle and strangely serious. "I am saying," she replied softly, "that the past you buried might still be alive." Felix stared at her, and for the first time since hearing his diagnosis, a new kind of fear began to grow inside him. Not the fear of dying, but the fear that the truth he had avoided for 30 years was about to return. The evening air in Makola Market had grown cooler. carrying with it the smell of roasted plantains and diesel from passing taxis. Many stalls had already closed, and the once crowded street now moved at a slower rhythm. Felix Quansah stood beside the coffin he had bought only hours earlier. Across from him, Nana Amasarwa watched quietly. The old woman's words still echoed in his mind. The past you buried might still be alive. Felix felt an uneasy tension settle in his chest. Not the physical pain of his illness, but something heavier, something older. "How do you know about Efua Nyarko?" he asked slowly. Nana Amasarwa did not answer immediately. Instead, she adjusted the cloth wrapped around her shoulders and glanced down the road where the small church stood beneath a flickering streetlight. "You ask many questions," she said calmly. "That name is not something a stranger should know. Perhaps I am not as much of a stranger as you think." Felix's eyes narrowed slightly. "What does that mean?" The old woman looked back at the coffin beside him. "You bought this today because you believe your life is ending," she said. "That is not belief, it is medical fact." "Maybe," Felix frowned. "You doubt it. I doubt many things," she replied. "But sickness is not the only reason a man prepares for death." Felix exhaled slowly. "You speak in riddles, because truth is rarely simple." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Night was settling over Accra now. Shopkeepers rolled metal shutters down over their storefronts. A group of young men laughed loudly as they passed by, still discussing the strange scene from earlier. Felix turned back to the old woman. "You still haven't answered my question." Nana Amasarwa finally stepped closer. "You want to know how I know the name Efua Nyarko," she said. "Yes." She studied his face carefully before responding. "Because long before you became Felix Quansah, the billionaire." She paused. "I was already watching your story." Felix felt his pulse quicken. "That makes no sense." "It will," she replied softly. "But not here." She gestured toward the dim street. "This place is too noisy for the kind of truth you are about to hear." Felix glanced at the coffin. "What about this? Leave it. I paid for it, and it will still be here tomorrow." Felix hesitated. For years he had trusted no one. His life had been built on contracts, calculations, and control. Yet something about Nana Amasarwa's calm certainty made it strangely difficult to argue with her. "Where are we going?" he asked. "The church." Felix looked toward the building at the end of the street. A small white structure stood between two older buildings. Its walls were worn, the paint faded by years of sun and rain. "You live there?" Felix asked. "Not exactly." She began walking slowly toward it. After a moment, Felix followed. They walked in silence for several minutes. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. Felix noticed how steady the old woman's pace was despite her age. "You walk like someone younger than 70, he said. Nana Amasarwa chuckled softly. "Life keeps poor people moving." When they reached the church, she pushed open a wooden side door. Inside, the space was simple. Rows of wooden benches, a small altar, soft yellow light from 2 ceiling bulbs. The room smelled faintly of candle wax and old wood. Felix stepped inside slowly. The quiet felt almost shocking after the chaos of the market. Nana Amasarwa placed her basket near the wall and sat on one of the benches. Felix remained standing. "Sit," she said. He hesitated for a moment before lowering himself onto the bench across from her. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Then Nana Amasarwa said quietly, "Tell me something, Felix Quansah." He looked up. "Do you believe people can escape their past?" Felix thought about the question. "Yes," he said eventually. "How by moving forward?" She shook her head gently. "That is not escaping. That is running." Felix leaned back slightly. "You think I've been running, I know you have." Her voice carried no accusation, only certainty. Felix rubbed his hands together slowly. You still haven't explained how you know about Afua. Nana Amasarwa took a deep breath. 30 years ago, she said a young pregnant woman was brought into Korlebu Teaching Hospital after a traffic accident. Felix felt his stomach tighten. She had been hit by a car late at night. He swallowed. The driver never stopped. Felix stared at the floor. Doctors treated her injuries, Nana Amasarwa continued, but she lost a great deal of blood. Felix's voice was barely above a whisper. Did she survive? The old woman looked at him. Yes. Felix's head snapped up. She lived. Yes. Relief and shock flooded through him at the same time. But her life changed forever, Nana Amasarwa added quietly. Felix leaned forward. What happened? She gave birth prematurely. Felix felt his heart pound. The child alive. The word hit him like thunder. You're telling me, he began, his voice shaking slightly, that my child survived. Nana Amasarwa watched him carefully. Yes. Felix stood abruptly. The bench scraped against the floor. That's impossible, he said. For 30 years I believed. You believed what was easiest for you to believe. She interrupted gently. Felix ran a hand through his hair. Why didn't Afua tell me? The old woman's expression grew sad. Because she never had the chance. Felix looked at her sharply. What do you mean? She tried to find you. The words landed heavily, but by the time she recovered, your life had already changed. Felix's mind raced. The contracts, the investors, the sudden rise of Quansah Holdings. Back then, he had moved quickly into a different world, a world where people like Afua Nyarko no longer seemed to belong. Did she hate me? Felix asked quietly. Nana Amasarwa looked down at her hands. No. That answer surprised him. She loved you, the old woman said softly. Even after everything. Felix felt a tight pressure in his chest again. Not from illness, from something deeper. Where is she now? He asked. The old woman remained silent. Felix's voice grew urgent. Where is Afua? Nana Amasarwa looked up slowly. Gone. The word seemed to echo inside the small church. Felix closed his eyes. Another weight settled over him. Then the child. He hesitated. Where is my child? The old woman held his gaze. That, she said quietly, is the question you should have asked 30 years ago. Felix sank back onto the bench. The room felt suddenly smaller. His entire life, his empire, his wealth, his reputation had been built on the assumption that he had left nothing behind. Now everything felt uncertain. You said you watched my story, Felix murmured. Yes. Why? The old woman took a long breath. Then she spoke the words that would change everything. Because the child Afua gave birth to. She paused. Was placed in my arms the night she died. Felix's head lifted slowly. Shock spread across his face. You raised my child. Nana Amasarwa nodded. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Felix Quansah, the powerful billionaire who had spent 30 years building an empire, sat frozen on a wooden church bench, realizing that somewhere in the city he had controlled for decades, his own child might still be walking its streets. For several seconds after Nana Amasarwa spoke, Felix Quansah could not move. The quiet inside the small church felt almost unreal. Outside, distant traffic hummed through the Accra night. But inside the room, the silence pressed against his ears. You raised my child, Felix repeated slowly. Nana Amasarwa did not immediately respond. She reached into her basket and took out a small bottle of water, unscrewing the cap carefully before taking a sip. Only then did she look back at him. Yes, she said calmly. Felix stared at her as if the words had not fully reached him. My child survived, he said. Yes, and you raised them. Yes. The word hung in the air. Felix leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His mind was racing through decades of memories and assumptions. 30 years. For 30 years, he had believed the story ended when Afua Nyarko disappeared from his life. Now suddenly, the story had not ended at all. It had continued without him. Why didn't anyone tell me? Felix asked. Nana Amasarwa studied his face carefully before answering. Because no one knew where to find you. Felix shook his head. That's impossible. I built Quansah Holdings right here in Accra. My name has been in the newspapers for decades. The old woman nodded. Yes, after. Felix frowned. What do you mean? She folded her hands together. When Afua Nyarko arrived at the hospital after the accident, you were not the man you are today. Felix exhaled slowly. That was before my first major contracts. Yes, she said, and before the city knew your name. Felix rubbed his temples, so she couldn't find me. She tried. The words struck him sharply. She tried, he repeated. Yes, Nana Amasarwa looked toward the altar for a moment before continuing. She asked nurses. She asked people at the construction site where you once worked. But by then you had already moved on. Felix closed his eyes. Back then, he had been changing jobs constantly, chasing opportunities, traveling across cities to meet investors. It would not have been easy to find him. But still, why didn't she come to my company later? He asked. Nana Amasarwa's voice softened. Because she died. The words fell into the quiet church like a stone into water. Felix's breath caught. You said earlier she died after the birth, he murmured. Yes, but she survived the accident. She did. Felix leaned back slowly. What happened? Nana Amasarwa hesitated before answering. The injuries weakened her body, she said, and the birth came too early. Felix felt something twist inside him. Did she suffer? He asked quietly. The old woman looked at him with gentle honesty. Yes. Felix lowered his head. For years he had imagined Afua Nyarko simply disappearing into another life. Now the truth was far heavier. She had died bringing his child into the world, and he had never known. The silence stretched between them. Finally, Felix asked the question that had been building inside him since the moment Nana Amasarwa revealed the truth. My child, he said slowly. Yes. Where are they now? Nana Amasarwa did not answer immediately. Instead, she studied him carefully. You ask that question quickly, she said. Of course I do, but the answer may not be easy. Felix's eyes hardened slightly. I deserve to know. The old woman's expression remained calm. Do you? Felix froze. What do you mean? 30 years ago, she said quietly, you walked away from Afua Nyarko and the life she carried. Felix's jaw tightened. I did not know she was pregnant when she left. You suspected. Felix did not respond. The truth was complicated. He had not confirmed the pregnancy, but he had not truly tried to either. At that time, ambition had been louder than responsibility. Nana Amasarwa continued. I raised that child, she said, fed them, protected them, watched them grow. Her voice held no anger, only fact. Felix felt a strange mixture of gratitude and shame. You gave them a life, he said quietly. Yes, thank you. The old woman nodded slightly, but her eyes remained steady. Gratitude is not the same as responsibility. Felix leaned forward again. I am not running from responsibility. Are you sure? Yes. Then answer one question honestly. Felix met her gaze. Ask, if I had never told you about this child tonight. She paused. Would you have spent your final month searching for them? Felix hesitated. The silence answered the question before he could speak. Nana Amasarwa nodded softly. That is why truth sometimes arrives late, she said. Felix exhaled slowly. "You're right," he admitted. "If I had not collapsed in the market today, if you had not spoken to me, I might have died without ever asking." The words felt heavy, but they were true. The old woman watched him quietly, and now she asked. Felix lifted his head. "Now I want to find them. Why? Because they are my child. That is not enough." Felix frowned. "What do you mean? Many men have children," she said. "Few become fathers." The statement lingered in the air. Felix absorbed it slowly. Then he asked again, "Where are they?" This time, Nana Amasarwa answered, "Still in Accra." Felix felt his pulse quicken. "What do? They work. At what? Helping people?" Felix's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Like Afua?" "Yes." A faint smile touched Nana Amasarwa's face. "Very much like her." Felix leaned back, trying to process everything. For 30 years he had built one of the largest business empires in Ghana. And somewhere in the same city lived the child he had never met. "What is their name?" he asked. The old woman looked at him carefully. "Before I tell you that," she said slowly, "you must understand something." Felix waited. "That child does not know you. I expected that, and they do not need your money." Felix nodded. "That's fine, and they may not want you in their life." The words landed sharply. Felix felt the possibility settle in his chest. He had spent decades making decisions others had no choice but to accept. But this situation would be different. "I understand," he said quietly. Nana Amasarwa studied his face for several seconds. Then she spoke. "The child's name is—" She paused. "Daniel." Felix repeated the name slowly. "Daniel. Yes. How old? 30. Felix let out a slow breath. 30 years, a full lifetime. "What does he do?" Felix asked. "He works at a community clinic not far from here." Felix looked surprised. "A clinic?" "Yes." "Is he a doctor?" "No, a nurse, no." "Then what?" Nana Amasarwa smiled faintly. "He fixes things." Felix frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "When equipment breaks, Daniel repairs it. When the building needs work, he fixes it. When people cannot pay for medicine, he helps them find another way." Felix sat quietly. "So he helps people," he said. "Yes." The irony was not lost on him. Felix Quansah had spent 30 years building wealth and power. His son had spent those same years helping strangers inside a small clinic, without ever knowing the connection between them. Felix looked toward the church door. "Does Daniel know about me?" Nana Amasarwa shook her head. "No." Felix felt another weight settle in his chest. "Should he?" The old woman's expression grew thoughtful. That she said softly, "Is the question your remaining time will have to answer." Felix stared at the floor. Remaining time. The phrase carried a new meaning now. Because for the first time since hearing his diagnosis, Felix Quansah realized something unexpected. His life might be ending, but his story was not finished yet. Felix Quansah did not leave the small church for a long time that night. He remained seated on the wooden bench, staring at the floor as if the rough patterns in the wood might somehow organize the chaos in his thoughts. Daniel, 30 years old. Living in the same city Felix had ruled from glass towers and boardrooms, helping people in a clinic, fixing broken machines, a life so different from the one Felix had imagined for his own child. Or perhaps Felix thought quietly it was exactly the life Afua Nyarko would have hoped for. Across the room, Nana Amasarwa sat patiently. She had seen many kinds of silence in her life, the silence of grief, the silence of anger, the silence of people finally confronting truths they had avoided for decades. Felix's silence tonight carried all three. Finally he spoke. "Does Daniel know about his mother?" "Yes," Nana Amasarwa said. "And about me?" Felix nodded slowly. What does he believe happened? The old woman folded her hands in her lap. He knows his mother died when he was born, she said, and he believes his father disappeared before he arrived. Felix felt a sharp stab of guilt. Which is not entirely wrong, he murmured. No, Nana Amasarwa agreed. It is not. Felix leaned back against the bench. What kind of man is he? She smiled faintly. A good one. That sounds like something every parent says. I am not his parent, she replied calmly. But I am the closest thing he has ever had. Felix nodded. You said he works at a clinic? Yes. Which one? The Amankora Community Clinic. Felix recognized the name immediately. It was located in a modest neighborhood, not far from one of the early construction sites where Quansah Holdings had begun expanding decades earlier. The coincidence made him uneasy. Does he live nearby? Felix asked. Yes. Alone, no, with me. Felix looked up in surprise. You still live together? Nana Amasarwa chuckled softly. Not because he needs to, because he refuses to leave. Felix imagined a 30-year-old man choosing to remain with the elderly woman who raised him. That alone told him something about Daniel's character. Does he know you're here tonight? Felix asked. No. Where does he think you are selling water? She said simply. Felix almost smiled at that. For a moment, the conversation felt almost normal. Then reality returned. I want to meet him, Felix said, quietly. The old woman did not react immediately. Instead, she asked another question. Why? Felix frowned. I already told you. He is my son. Yes, and I have little time left. Yes, so I want to see him. That is understandable. Felix sensed hesitation in her voice, but he pressed. Nana Amasarwa sighed gently. But meeting him may not bring the peace you expect. Felix leaned forward. What do you mean? She looked directly at him. You have built your life on control, Felix Quansah. That is how success works. Perhaps, she said. But relationships do not work that way. Felix did not respond. The truth of her words made him uncomfortable. You imagine meeting Daniel and telling him everything, she continued. You imagine he will be shocked, emotional, perhaps even grateful. Felix opened his mouth to respond, but stopped himself, because that had indeed been the image forming quietly in his mind. You cannot predict how another human heart will respond, Nana Amasarwa said. Felix rubbed his hands together slowly. What are you suggesting? That you think carefully before entering his life? Felix stood and began pacing slowly across the small church floor. For 30 years, I have been absent, he said. Yes. For 30 years he has lived without knowing who I am. Yes. And now you suggest I remain absent, I suggest you be prepared. Felix stopped walking. The illness in his body suddenly felt heavier. I may not have the luxury of time, he said quietly. The old woman's expression softened. I know. Felix looked toward the church door. Somewhere beyond those walls was the man who carried his blood. A man he had never seen. Does Daniel look like Afua? Felix asked suddenly. Nana Amasarwa smiled. Very much. Felix felt his chest tighten again. Does he know anything about his father? Only that he left. Felix nodded slowly. That part is true. The old woman studied him carefully. You are not the same man who left 30 years ago, she said. Felix gave a faint, tired smile. Cancer has a way of forcing reflection. Sometimes reflection comes too late. Felix could not argue with that. Outside, a distant church bell rang once. It was late. Felix checked his watch. Nearly 10 o'clock. For the first time in decades, he had spent an entire day away from his empire. And strangely, the world had continued turning without him. What will you do now? Nana Amasarwa asked. Felix thought for a moment. "Tomorrow," he said slowly, "I will visit the clinic." The old woman watched him carefully. As a patient, she asked. Felix shook his head. "No." As what, he hesitated, then answered honestly. "As a stranger." Nana Amasarwa nodded. "That may be wise." Felix sat back down on the bench. "I don't want him to feel trapped by my past," he said. "Good. But I do want to see him. That is natural." Felix looked toward the altar again. His life had been built on massive decisions, contracts worth millions, projects shaping entire neighborhoods. Yet now the most important decision of his remaining life felt strangely fragile. How do you approach a son who does not know you exist? "How did Daniel grow up?" Felix asked quietly. The old woman smiled softly at the memory. "He was curious," she said. "Always asking questions. About what, everything." She chuckled. "He used to take apart broken radios just to see how they worked." Felix imagined a young boy surrounded by scattered screws and wires. "That explains why he repairs machines now," Felix said. "Yes." The old woman's smile faded slightly, but he also asked one question I could never fully answer. Felix looked up. "What question?" Nana Amasarwa's voice softened. Where his father was. Felix felt the weight of those words settle deeply inside him. "And what did you tell him?" he asked. "I told him the truth I knew, and that was that sometimes adults make decisions they cannot undo." Felix looked down at his hands. Decisions they cannot undo. His entire empire had been built on the belief that any mistake could be corrected with enough effort, money, or influence. But this mistake had lasted 30 years. "Tomorrow," Felix said quietly, "I will go to that clinic." Nana Amasarwa nodded, and then Felix lifted his eyes. "Then we will see what kind of man my son has become." The old woman studied him carefully. "And what kind of man you have become?" Felix did not answer, because for the first time in a very long time, Felix Quansah was no longer certain he knew the answer. Felix Quansah did not sleep much that night. The mansion overlooking the Atlantic Ocean was quiet as always, but the silence felt different now. For years, Felix had been accustomed to returning home, late exhausted from meetings, contracts, and negotiations. Sleep had always come easily then, but tonight, sleep refused to stay. Every time Felix closed his eyes, the same thoughts returned. Daniel, 30 years old, working at a clinic, living with Nana Amasarwa, his son. The word still felt unfamiliar in Felix's mind. He stood by the glass wall of his bedroom, watching the dark waves of the Atlantic rolling against the shore. The ocean had always calmed him before, but tonight it only reminded him how quickly time moved. 30 years. 30 years of life he had missed. At dawn, Felix made a decision. He dressed simply, dark trousers, a light shirt, no suit jacket, the kind of clothing that would allow him to walk through the streets of Accra without attracting attention. He left the mansion without informing his staff. The security guards at the gate exchanged confused glances as he walked out alone. "Should we call the driver?" one asked. Felix shook his head. "I'll walk." The morning air was cool and fresh. Accra was just beginning to wake. Market traders arranged vegetables on wooden tables. Minibus drivers shouted destinations to early commuters. Felix moved through the city quietly, just another man on the street. But inside his mind, tension built with every step. Amankora Community Clinic. The name echoed in his thoughts. He had looked it up before leaving the house. It was located nearly 40 minutes away on foot in a modest neighborhood where many families could not afford private medical care. The clinic itself had once been a small building owned by a church. Years ago, Quansah Holdings had actually donated materials to expand it during one of their early charity projects. The irony was almost painful. Felix had helped build the place where his son now worked without ever knowing. The sun had fully risen by the time he reached the street where the clinic stood. The building was simple but clean. White walls, a blue metal roof. A small sign above the entrance read, Amancora Community Clinic. Several people sat on wooden benches outside waiting for treatment. A mother with a coughing child, an elderly man holding his arm, a young woman with a bandaged ankle. Felix slowed his steps. Somewhere inside that building was Daniel, his son. Felix's chest tightened slightly, not from illness this time, but from nerves. For a man who had negotiated billion-dollar deals, the simple act of walking through a clinic door suddenly felt overwhelming. He stood across the street for several minutes, watching, listening, trying to imagine which of the voices inside might belong to Daniel. Then the door opened. A young man stepped outside carrying a small toolbox. Felix's breath stopped. The man looked about 30 years old. Medium height, lean build, dark skin, and a face that carried unmistakable echoes of Afua Nyarko. Felix felt something shift inside him instantly. Daniel. He knew it without needing confirmation. The resemblance was too strong. Daniel knelt beside a broken wheelchair near the entrance. A woman sat beside it, looking worried. "Don't worry," Daniel said gently. "It's only the wheel joint." His voice was calm and warm. Felix remained across the street watching. Daniel opened the toolbox and removed a small wrench. Within minutes, he had loosened the damaged bolt and replaced it with a new one. The wheelchair rolled smoothly again. The woman smiled in relief. "Thank you," she said. Daniel waved the gratitude away. "It's nothing." Felix felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. He had seen thousands of employees work for him over the years, managers, engineers, executives. But watching his son kneel on the pavement to repair a stranger's wheelchair felt strangely more powerful than any boardroom success. Daniel stood and wiped his hands on a cloth. Then he noticed Felix across the street. Their eyes met briefly. Felix felt a sudden wave of panic. For a moment, he feared Daniel might somehow recognize him. But of course, that was impossible. Daniel had never seen him before. Still, the young man offered a polite nod, the simple acknowledgement strangers sometimes give each other. Felix returned the nod automatically. Daniel turned back toward the clinic entrance. Felix exhaled slowly. "So this is him, my son." He watched Daniel disappear inside the building. For a moment, Felix considered leaving. He had seen what he needed to see. Daniel was alive, kind, helping people. Maybe that was enough. But something inside Felix refused to accept that. He crossed the street. Each step felt heavier than the last. By the time he reached the clinic door, his heart was beating faster. Inside the clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and medicine. A receptionist sat behind a small desk. "Good morning," she said. Felix nodded. "Good morning. Do you need treatment?" Felix hesitated. "Yes." She handed him a clipboard. "Please fill this out and take a seat." Felix sat among the other patients and pretended to complete the form. His eyes moved quietly around the room. 2 nurses worked behind a counter preparing medicine. An elderly doctor examined a patient in a nearby room. And near the back wall, Daniel stood repairing a malfunctioning blood pressure monitor. Felix watched him carefully. The movements were precise and confident. Years of experience in small mechanical repairs showed in the way Daniel handled each screw and wire. After a few minutes, the machine beeped successfully. Daniel smiled slightly and returned it to the nurse. "Try it now." The nurse nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Daniel." Felix heard the name spoken aloud for the first time. Daniel. His son. The name felt heavier now. Felix's illness suddenly reminded him of its presence again with a dull ache in his chest. He leaned back slightly in his chair. One thought echoed through his mind. Should I tell him? But another thought quickly followed. What if he hates me? 30 years of absence could not be erased with a simple conversation. The receptionist called another patient's name. Time moved slowly inside the waiting room. Felix realized something surprising. He was afraid, not of cancer, not of death, but of the possibility that Daniel might look at him and see nothing but the man who abandoned his mother. Felix closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, Daniel was standing only a few steps away. The young man had come over to check another piece of equipment beside Felix's chair. Up close, the resemblance to Afua was even stronger. The same eyes, the same quiet strength in his expression. Daniel glanced at him politely. "Are you waiting for the doctor?" he asked. Felix swallowed. "Yes." Daniel nodded. "The wait might take a while today. We're short on staff." Felix forced himself to speak normally. "That's okay." Daniel gave a friendly smile before returning to his work. Felix watched him silently. And for the first time since hearing his diagnosis, Felix Quansah understood something clearly. Finding his son had been the easy part. The real challenge would be finding the courage to tell him the truth. Felix Quansah remained seated in the waiting area of a Mancora community clinic. Long after the clipboard in his hands had stopped making sense, he had filled in his name automatically, Felix Quansah, before realizing what he had done. Anyone in Accra who followed business news would recognize that name. For a moment, he considered crossing it out, but then he stopped himself. Perhaps it was time to stop hiding. Across the room, Daniel continued working. He moved from one small task to another, with quiet efficiency. Adjusting a loose cabinet hinge, checking a small oxygen machine, helping a nurse move a box of supplies. No one treated him like an employee beneath them. They spoke to him with easy familiarity. "Daniel, can you look at this?" "Daniel." The printer stopped again. "Daniel, thank you." Each time he answered with the same calm tone. "I'll check it. Give me a moment." "No problem." Felix watched every movement carefully. The young man had none of the arrogance Felix had once believed necessary for success. There was patience in him, a quiet steadiness, something that reminded Felix painfully of Afua Nyarko. A nurse approached Felix after a while. "You can see the doctor now," she said. Felix stood slowly and followed her into a small consultation room. The doctor inside was an elderly man with silver hair and kind eyes. He looked up from a file as Felix entered. "Good morning," he said. Felix nodded. "Good morning." The doctor glanced at the clipboard in front of him. Then he froze. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Felix Quansah. Felix felt the moment arrive. "Yes." The doctor studied him carefully. "Are you the Felix Quansah?" Felix gave a faint smile. "I suppose that depends which one you mean." The doctor chuckled quietly. "Well, if you are the man who built half the construction projects in this city, then I believe I know which one." Felix sat down. "I am that man." The doctor leaned back in his chair. "What brings a billionaire to a small community clinic?" Felix considered the question carefully. "Curiosity." The doctor raised an eyebrow. "That is not a common medical complaint." Felix hesitated before answering. "I came to see someone." The doctor followed his gaze briefly toward the hallway. Daniel Felix nodded. The doctor's expression changed slightly. "You know him?" "Not exactly." "But you came to see him?" "Yes." The doctor folded his hands. "That young man has a habit of attracting interesting visitors." Felix frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" The doctor smiled faintly. "People come here for treatment, but many stay because of him." Felix leaned forward. "Why, because Daniel helps everyone." The doctor gestured toward the hallway. "You saw him fixing equipment, yes. He also helps patients fill forms if they cannot read. He carries elderly patients inside when they are too weak to walk. He even spends his own money buying medicine. when families cannot afford it. Felix listened quietly. He has been here for 6 years, the doctor continued. The clinic would collapse without him. Felix felt a strange mixture of pride and sorrow rising inside him. A son he had never raised had somehow grown into a man any father would admire. Where did he learn those skills? Felix asked. From life, the doctor replied simply. Felix nodded slowly. Then he asked the question that had been pressing in his mind. Does he ever talk about his parents? The doctor's expression softened. Sometimes, and he speaks warmly about the woman who raised him, Nana Ama Serwa. Yes, and his father. The doctor shook his head. Daniel rarely mentions him. Felix looked down. What does he believe happened? He believes his father left before he was born. Felix exhaled slowly. That belief is not entirely wrong. The doctor studied him carefully. Why are you asking these questions? Mr. Quansah. Felix hesitated. The truth stood on the edge of his tongue. But speaking it aloud still felt terrifying. I'm thinking about making a donation to this clinic, Felix said instead. The doctor blinked in surprise. That would be extraordinary. Felix nodded. This place helps people. Yes, it deserves support. The doctor smiled warmly. I will not argue with that. A knock sounded on the door. The nurse stepped inside. Doctor, the blood pressure machine stopped working again. The doctor sighed. Daniel, he's already fixing it. The doctor chuckled. Of course he is. Felix stood. I should go. You're not staying for treatment. Felix shook his head. No. As he stepped into the hallway again, he saw Daniel kneeling beside the broken machine. The young man looked up briefly. Doctor needs this in 5 minutes, Daniel said casually. Felix found himself smiling. You seem busy. Daniel wiped his hands. It's a normal day. Felix hesitated. Then he spoke again. You're very good at what you do. Daniel shrugged. I just fix things. Felix studied him closely. Not everyone cares enough to do that. Daniel gave a small, modest smile. Well, someone has to. Felix felt a strange warmth in his chest. If only Afua could see him now. Do you enjoy working here? Felix asked. Yes. Why? Daniel leaned back slightly, thinking. Because people need help. Felix nodded. That's simple. Daniel smiled. Simple things are often the most important. The words landed deeply inside Felix. For 30 years he had chased complexity contracts, investment strategies. Yet here was his son, living a life built on simple purpose. Felix suddenly realized something painful. Daniel had grown into the kind of person Felix himself had never become. Thank you for keeping this place running, Felix said quietly. Daniel looked slightly embarrassed. It's just my job. Felix extended his hand. My name is Felix. Daniel shook it politely. Daniel. Their hands met for the first time. Father and son, neither of them speaking the truth. Yet, something in the moment felt strangely powerful. Daniel released the handshake. Are you feeling okay? He asked. Felix blinked. Why do you ask? You look pale. Felix almost laughed. I suppose I am not as strong as I once was. Daniel nodded. If you ever need help, you can come here. The kindness in his voice made Felix's chest tighten again. I might do that, Felix said. Then he turned toward the door. As he stepped outside the clinic, the sunlight hit his face. The city moved around him exactly as it always had. But inside, something had changed. For the first time since learning he was dying, Felix Quansah felt a new kind of urgency. Not about business, not about money, but about time. Because now he understood something clearly. He did not just want to see his son. He wanted a chance, however small, to become the father he had never been. Felix Quansah did not walk far after leaving the clinic. He stopped at a small roadside bench beneath a mango tree across the street from Amankora Community Clinic. The morning sun had grown warmer and the sounds of Accra traffic had returned to their usual rhythm. But Felix barely noticed. His mind was still inside the clinic, still replaying the moment his hand had shaken Daniel's. For 30 years, Felix had imagined what it might feel like to hold the hand of his child. He had never expected the moment to happen so quietly. No dramatic revelation, no emotional confrontation, just a simple handshake between two strangers. Felix leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. Daniel. The name no longer felt like a distant story. It had a face now, a voice, a life, and that life had grown strong without him. The realization brought both pride and pain. Across the street, the clinic door opened again. Daniel stepped outside carrying a cardboard box of medical supplies. Felix watched him for a moment. The young man walked toward a delivery motorcycle, parked near the curb. Careful with those, a nurse called from the doorway. Daniel laughed lightly. I know. They're the only working thermometers we have left. Felix frowned slightly at that. Only working thermometers. The words stuck in his mind. Quansah Holdings had once spent millions importing medical equipment for large private hospitals, yet this small community clinic was struggling to keep basic tools functioning. Felix felt a quiet sense of responsibility begin to grow. But before he could think further, another sound interrupted his thoughts. A familiar voice behind him. Felix Quansah. Felix turned slowly. Standing a few steps away was a tall man in a gray suit. Richard Quansah, Felix's cousin. Richard's expression carried a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. I wondered where you had disappeared, to Richard said. Felix straightened slightly. What are you doing here? Richard smiled thinly. I could ask you the same question. He glanced toward the clinic. This doesn't seem like the usual environment for a billionaire. Felix did not answer immediately. Richard continued speaking. The board meeting yesterday was interesting. Felix's eyes narrowed slightly. Was it yes? Richard slipped his hands into his pockets. Everyone seems very confused about your recent financial decisions. Felix sighed quietly. I imagine they are. You've been selling major assets, Richard said. Factories, properties, shipping contracts. Yes, without explanation. Felix met his cousin's gaze calmly. Do I need permission to sell what belongs to me? Richard chuckled softly. No. He leaned slightly closer. But the board is beginning to wonder whether you are still capable of leading the company. Felix felt a flicker of irritation. That question has never been asked before. Circumstances change. Felix studied Richard carefully. For years he had known that his cousin harbored ambition. But Richard had always been patient. Careful. Now that patience seemed to be fading. Let me guess, Felix said quietly. You're positioning yourself to take control. Richard smiled again. If the company needs stability, someone must provide it. Felix looked toward the clinic. Through the open door, he could see Daniel helping an elderly patient walk toward a chair. A man who had grown into strength without power, without wealth, without influence. Felix suddenly felt tired of the kind of conversation Richard represented. I'm not interested in discussing corporate politics today, Felix said. Richard raised an eyebrow. That's new. Felix stood from the bench. Is it? For 30 years, your entire life has revolved around the company. Felix glanced back at him. Perhaps that was the problem. Richard watched him carefully. You're behaving strangely, Felix. Felix almost smiled. I'm dying. The words came out calmly. Richard blinked. What stage 4 cancer? The statement landed like a stone between them. For the first time, Richard looked genuinely shocked. You're serious? Yes, how long? A few months. Richard's expression shifted quickly, shock giving way to calculation. Felix noticed. You see opportunity, Felix said quietly. Richard did not deny it. Well, the company will need leadership. Felix nodded slowly. Of course. Richard glanced again toward the clinic. And what exactly are you doing here? Felix considered how much to reveal. Finally, he said simply, I'm thinking. Richard laughed softly. That's dangerous. Why? Because when powerful men start thinking about life instead of profit, things usually change. Felix looked back toward the clinic entrance. Yes, that's exactly what's happening. Richard followed his gaze. Do you know someone here? Felix did not answer. But at that moment, Daniel stepped outside again, wiping his hands on a cloth. Richard noticed the direction of Felix's attention. Who's that? He asked. Felix hesitated. For a moment, he almost spoke the truth, but instinct stopped him. No one. Felix said quietly. Richard studied Daniel for another moment. Strange place for you to spend your time, he said. Felix nodded. Perhaps. Richard adjusted his jacket. Well, if you're finished reflecting on life, the board expects answers soon. Felix looked at him calmly. They will get them. When soon? Richard began walking away. Then he paused. One more thing, he said. Felix waited. If you're really dying, the transition of power needs to happen quickly. Felix's voice was steady. I'll handle it. Richard nodded. I'm sure you will. Then he left. Felix watched his cousin disappear down the street. The conversation left a bitter taste in his mouth. For decades he had fought battles like this: power struggles, corporate maneuvering, silent competitions for control. But today, those battles felt strangely distant, because none of them mattered anymore. Felix looked back toward the clinic. Daniel was helping a small child climb onto a chair. The boy laughed as Daniel pretended the chair was a spaceship. Felix felt something warm stir inside him. This is what life looks like when it isn't built on power. For a moment he imagined what the last 30 years might have been like if he had chosen differently, if he had stayed with Afua, if he had watched Daniel grow, if he had learned the simple joys of fatherhood. But regret could not change the past. Felix knew that all he had now was the time that remained, and the truth he had not yet spoken. Across the street, Daniel looked up again. Their eyes met briefly. Felix raised a hand in a small wave. Daniel smiled politely in return. A stranger acknowledging another stranger. Yet Felix felt something powerful in that simple gesture. Because somewhere deep inside him, a decision was beginning to form. The next time he spoke to Daniel, he would not hide the truth. Felix Quansah returned to Makola Market the following afternoon. The market looked almost identical to the day before, crowded walkways, vendors calling out prices, the scent of fried plantains mixing with dust and traffic fumes. But for Felix, everything felt different. The world had shifted, not outside, inside him. Somewhere in the market stood the coffin he had purchased, the wooden box he once believed would be the final symbol of his life. Yesterday it had represented defeat. Today it felt like a question. Felix walked slowly through the narrow rows of stalls until he reached the small furniture shop where the coffin maker worked. The man looked up immediately. "Ah, the man with the coffin," he said with a grin. Felix nodded. "Did you keep it?" The coffin maker laughed. "I thought you might come back." He pointed to the corner of the shop. The same rough wooden coffin leaned against the wall, untouched. Felix stepped closer. For a long moment he simply looked at it. The unfinished wood. The simple shape. Yesterday it had seemed appropriate. A humble ending for a life he believed had been empty of meaning. But after meeting Daniel, the coffin looked different. Smaller, less final. "You still want it?" the coffin maker asked. Felix hesitated. Yes. The man shrugged. Then take it. Felix lifted one end carefully. The weight felt familiar now. He dragged it outside the stall and placed it gently on the pavement. People nearby immediately began noticing. That man again, the Coffin man. Phones appeared once more. But Felix did not care. He stood beside the coffin quietly. Across the market, another figure moved through the crowd. Nana Ama-Serwa. She had just finished arranging her small basket of water sachets near the church entrance when she noticed the gathering. Curiosity drew her closer. When she saw Felix standing beside the coffin, she sighed softly. "You came back," she said. Felix turned toward her. "Yes." She looked at the wooden box, and the coffin came back too. Felix nodded. "I thought about it last night, and I realized something." Nana Ama-Serwa folded her arms. "What did you realize?" Felix rested his hand lightly on the coffin lid. "I bought this because I believed my life was already finished." The old woman waited. "But yesterday I learned something I did not expect." Felix continued, "Which is that I still have something left to do." Nana Ama-Serwa watched him carefully. "Your son." "Yes." She nodded slowly. "And what will you do about him?" Felix took a deep breath. "I'm going to tell him the truth." The old woman did not react immediately. Instead, she asked quietly, "Are you ready for whatever happens after that?" Felix looked toward the busy street. "No." "Then why do it?" "Because time is not waiting for me." The honesty in his voice made Nana Ama-Serwa soften slightly. "You went to the clinic today," she said. Felix looked surprised. "How did you know I passed by earlier?" She smiled faintly. "You stood outside for nearly 20 minutes before going in." Felix chuckled quietly. "I suppose I looked nervous. You looked like a man standing at the door of his own past." Felix nodded slowly. "That sounds accurate." "What did you think of Daniel?" she asked. Felix's expression changed. Pride flickered across his face. "He's remarkable." Nana Ama-Serwa's eyes warmed. "Yes. He helps people. Yes. He's kind. Yes." Felix looked down at the coffin again. "He became the kind of man I never was." The old woman shook her head gently. "You became the kind of man who built the world he grew up in." Felix did not respond, because he knew the truth was more complicated than that. Suddenly a loud voice broke through the crowd. "Well, well." Felix recognized the voice instantly. Richard Quansah. His cousin approached through the gathering spectators, with two men in suits behind him. Richard's eyes moved from Felix to the coffin. "This is becoming quite a spectacle," he said dryly. Felix remained calm. "What do you want?" Richard gestured toward the crowd. "You're embarrassing the company." Felix almost laughed. "I'm dying, Richard. That doesn't mean you need to become a public circus." Felix's eyes hardened slightly. "This has nothing to do with the company." Richard's voice dropped. "Everything you do has something to do with the company." Felix ignored him. Richard stepped closer to the coffin. "You know what people are saying," he continued, "that Felix Quansah has lost his mind." Felix met his gaze calmly. "Let them talk." Richard shook his head. "You've started selling company assets. You're wandering markets buying coffins. Investors are asking questions." Felix's voice remained steady. "The company will survive. And you." Felix glanced briefly at Nana Ama-Serwa. "Maybe not." Richard studied him carefully. "Are you really dying?" "Yes." For a moment, Richard seemed almost sympathetic. Then the calculating look returned. "In that case, the board needs a clear transition plan." Felix understood exactly what he meant. "You want control." Richard smiled slightly. "I want stability." Felix looked around the market. The people watching, the cheap coffin. the ordinary life he had ignored for decades. "Take it," Felix said quietly. Richard blinked. "What?" "The company," Felix continued. "Take it." Richard stared at him in disbelief. "You're serious?" "Yes." The two men behind Richard exchanged surprised looks. "But the assets you've been selling," Richard began. "Those funds will go somewhere else," Felix said. Where Felix glanced toward Nana Ama-Serwa again. "Where they're needed." Richard narrowed his eyes. "You're giving away your fortune." Felix shrugged. "I don't need it where I'm going," the crowd murmured around them. Richard shook his head slowly. "You really have lost your mind." Felix did not argue. Instead, he rested both hands on the coffin lid. "For years I built something enormous," he said quietly. "But I forgot something simple." Richard frowned. What Felix looked toward the church, then toward the road leading to the clinic. Why life matters. The crowd fell unusually quiet. Even Richard seemed unsure how to respond. Felix closed his eyes briefly. Then he spoke the words that would change everything. "This coffin is not for my body anymore." Richard laughed. "Oh, what is it?" For Felix opened his eyes. "For the man I used to be." Nana Ama-Serwa smiled softly. Because for the first time since she met him, Felix Quansah finally sounded like someone ready to face the truth. And soon, he would face the person who mattered most. His son. The crowd in Makola Market slowly dispersed after Richard Quansah and his associates walked away. People returned to their bargaining and selling, though many still glanced curiously toward the strange scene that had just unfolded. Word had already begun, spreading through the market. The billionaire Felix Quansah had publicly given up control of his empire and stood beside a cheap wooden coffin, declaring that his old life was over. For most people, it sounded unbelievable. But for Felix, the decision felt strangely peaceful. The coffin remained where he had placed it, leaning against the edge of the furniture stall. Its rough wooden boards glowed faintly under the late afternoon sunlight. Nana Ama-Serwa watched him quietly. "You have done something very difficult today," she said. Felix exhaled slowly. "I should have done it years ago, perhaps." The old woman stepped closer. "But the past cannot be rewritten. Only the future can." Felix nodded. "And I don't have much of that." She looked at him carefully. "Time is not always measured in years." Felix gave a faint smile, spoken like someone who has lived a long life. Nana Ama-Serwa chuckled softly. "Long enough to know that one honest moment can weigh more than 30 dishonest years." Felix turned toward the street. Cars moved slowly through the crowded intersection. Vendors shouted prices. Life continued exactly as it had before. Yet something in Felix felt lighter. For the first time since hearing his diagnosis, he no longer felt like a man waiting to die. He felt like a man finally beginning to live honestly. "What will you do now?" Nana Ama-Serwa asked. Felix hesitated. "Find Daniel and tell him yes." The old woman nodded slowly. "That is the right path." Felix looked toward the road leading away from the market. The clinic was only a short walk from here. But the distance suddenly felt enormous. "What if he refuses to see me again?" Felix asked quietly. Nana Ama-Serwa smiled gently. "That is his choice. And if he hates me, that is also his choice." Felix rubbed his hands together. "I deserve that." The old woman studied him carefully. "You deserve the truth." Felix looked down at the coffin. "And what about this?" "Leave it," she said. "Why? Because it has already served its purpose." Felix frowned slightly. "What purpose?" "It helped you understand that your life was not finished." Felix considered that. For years he had believed power and wealth defined success. Yet a cheap coffin in a market had forced him to confront the truth of his life more than any boardroom meeting ever had. "Maybe you're right," he said. Nana Amasarwa nodded. Go to the clinic. Felix took a deep breath. Yes. They began walking together through the busy streets of Accra. The afternoon sun dipped lower toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the pavement. Felix noticed details he had once ignored. Children laughing outside small shops, women balancing baskets of fruit on their heads, the smell of grilled fish drifting from a roadside stall. Life everywhere. Simple, uncomplicated. After nearly 20 minutes, the white walls of Amankora Community Clinic appeared again at the end of the street. Felix slowed his steps. Nana Amasarwa noticed immediately. You are afraid, she said. Felix nodded honestly. Yes, that is good. Felix looked at her. Why? Because only the arrogant feel no fear when facing truth. They reached the clinic entrance. Through the open doorway, Felix could see Daniel again. His son was helping an elderly man sit down on a bench. Daniel spoke patiently, explaining how to take the medication the doctor had prescribed. Felix watched quietly. The scene felt almost unreal. 30 years of absence had led to this moment. Nana Amasarwa touched Felix's arm gently. I will wait outside, she said. Felix nodded. Thank you. He stepped through the clinic door. The waiting room looked much the same as earlier that day. Patients sat quietly. The nurses moved between rooms. Daniel stood near the counter organizing small boxes of medicine. Felix walked toward him slowly. Each step felt heavier. Finally, Daniel looked up. Recognition flashed across his face. Oh, hello again, he said with a friendly smile. Felix stopped a few feet away. Hello, Daniel. The young man looked slightly surprised. You remember my name? Felix nodded. Yes. Daniel laughed lightly. I suppose it's not difficult. Everyone here calls me that all day. Felix swallowed. There's something I need to tell you. Daniel noticed the seriousness in his tone. Is something wrong? Felix hesitated. The entire room seemed to fade around him. For 30 years he had avoided this moment. But now there was no more running. Yes, Felix said quietly. Daniel's expression became concerned. Are you feeling worse? Felix shook his head. It's not about my health. Then what is it? Felix took a slow breath. My name is Felix Quansah. Daniel blinked. I know. Felix studied his face carefully. You recognize the name? Daniel shrugged slightly. Of course, everyone in Ghana knows that name. Felix nodded, but that's not the important part. Daniel frowned slightly. What do you mean? Felix's voice grew softer. I knew your mother. The words landed gently but heavily. Daniel froze. My mother. Felix nodded. Efua Nyarko. The name struck like lightning. Daniel's expression changed instantly. How do you know that name? He asked. Felix felt his chest tighten, because he said quietly, 30 years ago, she was the most important person in my life. Daniel stared at him in confusion. What are you saying? Felix forced himself to continue. I made a terrible mistake back then. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. What kind of mistake? Felix's voice trembled for the first time. I left her. Silence filled the room. Daniel's face slowly hardened. You're telling me you knew my mother? Felix nodded. Yes. Daniel took a step back. And you waited 30 years to say something? Felix swallowed. I didn't know she was pregnant when she left. Daniel's hands tightened into fists. That doesn't excuse disappearing. Felix did not argue. You're right. The young man's breathing grew heavier. Why are you telling me this now? Felix looked directly into his son's eyes. Because I'm dying. The words seemed to freeze the air between them. Daniel blinked. What cancer? Felix's voice was calm. Stage 4. Daniel stared at him. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Felix finished the sentence he had been carrying inside his heart since the moment he saw Daniel. "And before I die," he paused, "you deserve to know the truth." The clinic waiting room fell strangely quiet. A few patients glanced over curiously at the two men standing near the counter, sensing the tension but not understanding the reason. Daniel stared at Felix Quansah, as if trying to decide whether the man in front of him was serious. "You're dying," Daniel repeated slowly. Felix nodded. "Yes." Daniel looked away for a moment, running a hand across his face. His thoughts seemed to collide with each other all at once. 30 years. 30 years believing his father had simply disappeared. And now suddenly, that man stood in front of him, alive, powerful, and confessing the truth in the middle of a small community clinic. Daniel's voice grew tight. "So you came here. Because you're dying." Felix did not try to soften the reality. "Yes." Daniel laughed quietly, but the sound held no humor. "That's convenient." Felix absorbed the bitterness without protest. "You have every right to feel angry," he said. Daniel's eyes flashed. "You think anger is the problem?" "What is the problem?" Felix asked gently. Daniel pointed toward the clinic door. "The problem is that for 30 years my mother raised me alone." Felix lowered his head. "I know." "No, you don't," Daniel said sharply. "You weren't there." The words landed like blows. Felix did not defend himself. "I deserve that," he said quietly. Daniel studied him. The man in front of him did not look like the powerful billionaire Daniel had heard about in news reports. He looked tired, older than his years, and, strangely, fragile. Still, anger did not disappear easily. "You said you didn't know my mother was pregnant," Daniel said. "That's true. But you knew you left her." "Yes." Daniel crossed his arms. "So what exactly do you expect from me now?" Felix hesitated. "Nothing." Daniel frowned. "Nothing. I didn't come here asking for forgiveness." "Then why come?" Felix looked directly at him. "Because you deserve the truth." Daniel stared at him, and after that Felix's voice softened. "After that, the decision is yours." Daniel walked a few steps away, trying to steady his breathing. The clinic felt smaller now, more crowded, more intense. A nurse passed by carrying medicine but sensed the tension and quietly moved into another room. Daniel leaned against the wall. "I spent my entire life wondering who my father was," he said. Felix listened silently. "I imagined many things," Daniel continued. "Maybe he died. Maybe he was poor. Maybe he never knew I existed." Daniel looked back at Felix, "But I never imagined he was a billionaire who simply walked away." Felix accepted the accusation. "I can't change the past." "No, but I can face it." Daniel studied him carefully. For a moment, the anger in his eyes softened. "Did you love her?" he asked suddenly. Felix's answer came without hesitation. "Yes." Daniel frowned. "Then why leave?" Felix took a slow breath. "Because I was young. That's not an excuse." "No." "Then what is it?" Felix looked down at his hands. "I was afraid of losing the future I was chasing." Daniel waited. Felix continued quietly. "I thought success required sacrifice." Daniel shook his head. "So you sacrificed your family?" "Yes." The honesty surprised Daniel. Most powerful men he had seen in news interviews never admitted fault so easily. "You built an empire," Daniel said. "Yes. And now you're giving it up." Felix nodded. "I already did." Daniel blinked. "What?" "This morning, I transferred control of the company." "To who?" "My cousin Richard." Daniel stared at him. "You're serious?" "Yes." "Why would you do that?" Felix looked around the small clinic, at the cracked walls, the old equipment, the crowded waiting benches. "Because I spent 30 years building something enormous," he said quietly. "But I forgot something important." Daniel waited. How to be a father. Silence filled the room again. Daniel rubbed his forehead slowly. You expect that confession to fix everything. Then what Felix reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document. He placed it gently on the table beside them. Daniel looked at it. What's that transfer document? For what Felix met his eyes. For the future. Daniel opened the paper carefully. Inside was a legal statement transferring a large portion of Felix's personal fortune into a trust. The trust's purpose was clearly written. Accra Community Health Foundation. Daniel looked up in shock. This is for the clinic. Yes, Daniel shook his head. This is millions, Felix nodded. You said earlier, the clinic barely has working thermometers. Daniel stared at him. You're giving all this away. Yes. Why Felix's answer was simple. Because this place helped me understand what really matters. Daniel looked down at the document again. For a moment, the anger in his chest loosened slightly. Not gone, but softened. You're trying to buy forgiveness, he said. Felix shook his head. No. Then what I'm trying to leave something meaningful behind. Daniel was quiet for several seconds. Finally, he asked softly, How long do you have? Felix answered honestly. A few months. Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly. The anger inside him shifted into something more complicated. Sadness, confusion, even a little sympathy. You should sit down, Daniel said. Felix smiled faintly. Doctor's orders. Daniel nodded. Felix sat on one of the waiting chairs. Daniel sat across from him. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Two men connected by blood but separated by decades. Finally, Daniel spoke again. You can't change 30 years, he said. I know, but you told the truth. Felix nodded. That's all I have left. Daniel sighed. Then maybe we start there. Felix looked surprised. Start. Daniel shrugged slightly. You're still a stranger to me. I understand, but maybe we can talk. Felix felt something warm move through his chest. Hope. A small one, but real. I would like that, he said quietly. Daniel stood. I finish work in an hour. Felix nodded. I'll wait. As Daniel returned to help another patient, Felix leaned back in the chair. For the first time since his diagnosis, he no longer felt like a man waiting alone for death, because across the room stood his son. And even though the past could never be undone, the future, however short it might be, still held the possibility of healing.
Life often teaches its most powerful lessons in the moments we least expect. Felix Quansah spent 30 years believing that success meant power, wealth, and control. He built an empire that changed the skyline of Accra and influenced thousands of lives. Yet in the quiet hours after his diagnosis, he discovered something many people learn too late. Success without love is empty. The day Felix collapsed beside a cheap coffin in Makola Market, people saw a strange scene, a billionaire preparing for his own death. But what they could not see was the deeper truth. Felix was not buying a coffin for his body. He was burying the man he used to be, a man who chose ambition over family, a man who believed money could replace time, a man who thought the past could stay buried forever. But life has a way of returning us to the truths we avoid. Through the kindness of a poor old woman, Felix found the courage to face the one person who mattered most, his son. And in that simple clinic surrounded by broken machines and ordinary people helping each other survive, Felix discovered something wealth had never given him. A chance to make things right. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not completely. But honestly, this story reminds us of something powerful. Sometimes the richest person in the room is the one with the least money but the most compassion. And sometimes the greatest inheritance we can leave behind is not wealth, but truth, responsibility, and love. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from today, and what time is it in your country right now? Stories like this remind us that every life has the power to change, even at the very end. Don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who might need this message, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories about justice, healing, and unexpected kindness.
Because sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can change the course of an entire life.